December 1805. In the fog below the Pratzen Heights, two empires have walked into a trap. They don't know it yet. 200 years later, generals in 6 countries still study how that trap was set, and what happened when the man who set it tried it one time too many. More than 60 battles, fewer than 10 losses, an empire stretching from Spain to Russia. But Napoleon isn't studied because he was great. He's studied because no one has been better. His victories invented the rules of modern warfare. His failures predicted Vietnam and Afghanistan. To understand why a dead emperor still haunts the world's war rooms, we start at the beginning. 1769. A boy is born on the island of Corsica, just 1 year after France takes it from Genoa. He will build an empire from Lisbon to Moscow, and he will lose everything. But the truly strange part isn't what Napoleon achieved, it's what happened long after he was gone. Ulysses S. Grant studied his campaigns at West Point before winning the American Civil War. Eisenhower pored over his operational plans before commanding the Allied invasion of Europe. Karl von Clausewitz fought against Napoleon at Jena in 1806. He was captured. That defeat became the seed of On War, the most important book on military strategy ever written. Clausewitz became the bedrock of military thought, and he said Napoleon was indispensable to understanding war. So why, 200 years later, hasn't the world moved past him? The answer starts with speed. But to feel Napoleon's speed, you first need to feel what slow looked like. 18th century armies marched as a single mass, chained to enormous supply wagons. They crawled across Europe at 10 to 12 miles a day. Opponents watched each other maneuver for weeks. War was ritual, predictable, glacially slow, and Napoleon decided all of it was obsolete. He split his Grande Armée into independent corps, each with its own infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supplies. He could scatter them across 200 miles of territory, then converge them for battle at terrifying speed. The enemy never knew where the blow would fall. By the time they figured it out, it was over. September 1805. Napoleon's Grande Armée camps along the English Channel, poised to invade Britain. The invasion never comes. Austria and Russia threaten from the east. Napoleon pivots overnight. Within 6 weeks, his corps fan out across a 200-mile front and sweep into Central Europe. The Austrian army under General Mack has no idea what's happening until it's surrounded. October 20th, 33,000 Austrian soldiers surrender at Ulm, almost without a battle. Napoleon had outrun their ability to think. The war was won before it was fought. That principle has a name. It just wasn't coined for another century and a half. Colonel John Boyd called it the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act faster than your enemy. Boyd built that framework studying Napoleon's campaigns. Its ultimate test? Desert Storm, 1991. A 100-hour war. Was proof of concept. Now Napoleon turned east, toward what they still call his masterpiece. December 2nd, frozen fields near Austerlitz. 85,000 Allied soldiers face 73,000 French. Napoleon baits the Allied army into attacking his right flank. They commit everything. It's a trap. The Grande Armée smashes through the weakened Allied center, splitting the enemy army in two. 36,000 Allied casualties, 9,000 French. The most lopsided victory of the Napoleonic era. Historians still call it the most tactically perfect battle ever fought. The next year he turned his system on Prussia. At Jena, the finest army in Europe met Napoleon. By nightfall, both Prussian armies were destroyed. Not weakened, destroyed. French corps pursued at a speed the Prussians couldn't escape. Within 13 days, they captured Berlin. Frederick the Great's military legacy, the pride of Europe, erased in a single afternoon. This is what tempo warfare does. It doesn't just win battles. It collapses the enemy's ability to exist. But speed was only half the equation. Napoleon's other innovation was far more dangerous and far more lasting. Before him, war was a gentleman's profession. Armies fought. Civilians barely noticed. The French Revolution shattered that model. In 1793, France declared total national mobilization, the Levée en masse. Young men to battle. Married men forge weapons. Women sew uniforms. Children roll bandages. A civilization at war. Within a year, 1.5 million French soldiers, the largest army Europe had ever seen. Napoleon took that revolutionary energy and turned it into something personal, something almost religious. The night before battles, he walked through campfires, calling soldiers by name, asking about their families. Wellington, Napoleon's greatest rival, said his presence on a battlefield was worth 40,000 men, and Wellington knew firsthand. Napoleon himself put it plainly. The moral is to the physical, as 3 is to 1. By 1807, Napoleon controlled Europe from Spain to the borders of Russia. He seemed untouchable. But the very qualities that made him unstoppable were about to become catastrophic liabilities. What came next gave the world a new word, guerrilla. And what followed that killed nearly 600,000 men in a single winter. But there is a weapon history books bury in footnotes. Napoleon didn't just wage wars, he authored them. His battlefield bulletins were the first modern military propaganda. So full of lies, the French had a saying, "To lie like a bulletin." The most dangerous moment for any genius is when he starts believing his own myth. In 1808, Napoleon deposed the Spanish king. He put his own brother on the throne. The Spanish people answered with something the Grande Armée had never encountered. Not an army, an entire nation in armed revolt. They struck convoys at night, assassinated collaborators, and vanished into the mountains. Spain invented a new word for it. Guerrilla, little war. The word was born here. No formations to encircle, no supply lines to cut. Every French soldier in Spain was behind enemy lines. 300,000 French troops pinned down for 6 years. Napoleon called it his Spanish ulcer. And the British general learning to fight alongside those guerrillas? Wellington. Remember that name. Spain was a slow bleed. Russia was annihilation. June 1812. 685,000 men cross into Russia, the largest army Europe had ever assembled. The plan was classic Napoleon. Find the Russian army, destroy it, dictate peace. It had always worked. But General Kutuzov had been at Austerlitz. He'd learned the hard way. He would not fight. He retreated and retreated, burning crops and villages behind him, drawing Napoleon deeper into a continent with no end. At Borodino, 75 miles from Moscow. The armies finally collided. 70 to 80,000 casualties in a single day, the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic era. Napoleon held the field, but the Russian army pulled back intact, still alive, still refusing to break. He entered Moscow on September 14th. The Russians had burned it to the ground. No city, no people, no one to surrender. He waited 35 days for a peace offer that never came. When the retreat began in October, the Russian winter was already closing in. Disease, starvation, temperatures below -30. The army didn't retreat. It disintegrated. Of 685,000 men, fewer than 100,000 walked out of Russia. The man who mastered speed was destroyed by patience. The general who weaponized morale watched his army vanish. Spain and Russia gave the world two failure templates that have never gone obsolete: insurgency and overextension. In Vietnam, America confronted guerrillas who fought exactly like the Spanish, dispersed, hidden among civilians, refusing a decisive battle. The lesson Napoleon learned too late had to be learned again, at the cost of 58,000 American lives. In Afghanistan, the pattern repeated. 20 years of overwhelming firepower against a native insurgency in unforgiving terrain. The U.S. Army's counterinsurgency manual uses Napoleon's Spanish failure as a core teaching case. Napoleon's Spanish failure is in the footnotes of the manual America used in Afghanistan. It wasn't enough. And remember Wellington, the general who spent years fighting alongside Spanish guerrillas? He used everything Napoleon's failure taught him. Waterloo, 1815. The master's own disaster built the man who destroyed him. Napoleon died on St. Helena in 1821, 51 years old, exiled on a rock in the South Atlantic. But here's what makes Napoleon unique. It's not the victories. Alexander conquered more territory. It's not the defeats. It's that his career, victories and failures combined, mapped the entire territory of modern warfare. His wins defined the ceiling. What a commander achieves when speed, mass, and morale align perfectly. His failures defined the floor, where genius collapses against geography, time, and ordinary people who refuse to quit. No other figure in history is studied for both at every major military academy West Point, Sandhurst, Saint-Cyr, Russia, China. Nations that have fought each other for centuries, all studying the same man. That convergence tells you something no textbook can. The territory he mapped has not been escaped. And that brings us back to where we started. Austerlitz. Dawn. Fog over the Pratzen Heights. A man who saw further than anyone alive. The cadets at West Point aren't studying a dead emperor. They're studying a map of everything modern war can do and everything it can't. The problems he solved and the problems he failed to solve are still the problems. 200 years later, no one has drawn a better map. They've only followed